Cool. All right. This should be where we finished last time. With state development, Magna Carta, etc. Okay. I should make sure. Sound good. All right. So, yeah, again, Magna Carta was very important in the growth of what will become constitutional monarchies, but it's quite a ways off. But this is also the point in the book that I pull from for the at least I thought I did. I don't know if I can freaking find it anymore. Is it not showing up? This was seen as like the one of the high points of the Middle Ages, um, due to a sort of, well, some level of equality among the people. There we go. 273, not that you guys have the book. But that it wasn't just ruled by a power-hungry king, that people were gradually gaining more power. Even if it was just the nobility, but it at least meant that it wasn't just one guy in charge. All right, so during this time, um, the political treatises of the Middle Ages said that rulers should be both loved and feared because that's how they viewed God. We both loved and feared God, so that's how a good ruler should be. Henry II was the King of England after William the Conqueror died, put down rebellions in Scotland and Wales, and really he organized the regional authority in such a way that he didn't really have to be there. He spent most of his time down in Normandy because, again, technically England was a holding of Normandy, not the other way around. But because of how he did organize England, he didn't even have to be there because his local lords and whatnot could take care of it. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, who eventually, with her 3 sons, including one young Richard, rebelled against him. So that was a lot of drama. And by the way, if you don't have an idea for your second paper, Eleanor of Aquitaine is pretty fun. If you need to do your second paper, but that's just a thing, just an idea. He also had a dispute with the church, particularly an old friend of his who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. During one argument, he shouted, "Won't someone rid me of this troublesome priest?" To which his knights interpreted as, "Oh, he wants us to kill him." So they did. They followed Becket back to his cathedral and murdered him at the altar. Which is why, if you've had to read the Canterbury Tales, it's this guy's fault. It's, it's sort of Henry II's fault. It's more his knight's fault. But the reason that Canterbury became this like holy pilgrimage site was because Thomas Becket was, quote, martyred there, rather than, just he was killed because of a miscommunication. But hey, holy dude gets killed in his church. That's pretty dramatic. So the Church of Canterbury becomes this pilgrimage site. So Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, he was king for about 10 years. However, he spent about 6 months of that actually in England total. Not 6 months in a row, but 6 months total. He depleted the treasury that his father had left him because, again, his father had run a really tight ship and managed to maintain pretty good income across his realm. Well, Richard completely ran it dry, and also barely spoke English. So the people in the England part of his, whatever English was back then compared to today, we wouldn't be able to understand it either. But he wasn't a man of the people, needless to say. However, because he was a crusader, he was this guy that was going out for the honor of Christendom, etc., etc., he was seen as this big hero. Again, I bring up Robin Hood, where King Richard comes back and everybody's so happy because he's the good guy and he's going to get rid of his brother, the evil Prince John, whereas Prince John was the one who was running the place while Richard was off running around gallivanting as a crusader, and the reason that he was raising taxes was to pay for the ransom for Richard, who got his dumb ass captured. Not by the Muslims, but by some random Austrian prince. So, while popular history likes to remember Richard as this heroic figure, he really wasn't. But he was still much beloved by the people. Here's Thomas Becket being taken care of. I mean, dude never stood a chance. Here we have Richard Lionheart again. I don't know, for some reason this is really giving Monty Python vibes. Frederick II and St. Louis. So we have Frederick II, King of Sicily by age 3, so, real qualified there. The Pope was his guardian, so the Pope was, making sure that everything was running smoothly. By 18, he was made King of the Romans, and by age 26, he was made the Holy Roman Emperor. So he was doing a lot. I mean, sure, again, King of Italy by age 3, or King of Sicily by age 3. Not exactly a appointment based on merit, but he was doing a lot after this. He reclaimed Jerusalem through negotiation and political marriage, challenged the church on a bunch of assumed truths, and depending on which side you fell on, which is to say, if you believed that the Pope was completely infallible and could do no wrong, or not, you either hated the guy or you loved the guy. It's interesting that the guy who was pretty much raised by the Pope ends up questioning the Pope. So that's kind of neat. He wasn't just, a puppet. Meanwhile, we have St. Louis, King of France, went on crusade twice in the 7th and 8th Crusades, got captured in Egypt. He also sent emissaries to the Mongol Khans to try to convert them, which was something that the Pope did. He persecuted Jews and Muslims, taking their property to pay for more churches, which was seen as, a good thing by the Christian populace. He also died a good death on his second crusade, because apparently we're just freaking Klingons now. It's like, oh, he died in battle in the second crusade. What a hero. It's like, I don't know, that kind of sucks. I mean, not saying it sucks that he died in battle, because that's certainly a place to die, but that's not where I'd want to die. Especially if you're the King of France. You got other stuff you got to do. So there's Frederick. Apparently he was also into falconry, based on the image. And then St. Louis with the various icons of power here, this weird little hand thing, and the fleur-de-lis. So we started the chapter with cathedral schools, and well, we're gonna have to end the chapter with them going away because they did. They didn't last. Um, Education continued to increase, and the masters at the cathedral schools, which was typically just like one dude teaching the students that came in, that wasn't enough. So they began to develop places where multiple masters could come together and teach many, many more students, which eventually resulted in the university, which is pretty much the modern day university today. Now, sure, the things were certainly different based on many factors, but it's pretty much the same idea. The first obstacle to creating universities, though, was that they didn't have books. Not really. There weren't very many books, and the books that they had were usually just copies of the same book. There were areas where they did have old Greek texts in Europe, so the various monasteries where they had managed to get their hands on Greek texts and copy them onto papyrus, not papyrus, vellum, parchment, same thing. Byzantine and Islamic territories, again, many of these were taken from Jewish and Muslim holdings because the Jews and Muslims were kicked out and their stuff was just taken, and a lot of the times they had access to these scholarly materials. And interestingly enough, because so much of this material was from like the classical era, Plato, Aristotle, etc., it changed a lot of the medieval thought process. This brought Greek thought back to Europe. This from what it had been, we had Latin Rome and the Greek, Byzantine, and now we have this very just European Europe. You've got the French and the Germans and all of that. Well, now we're getting that introduction of the old classical Greek again. So, specifically discussing the birth of the universities, it was about a 25-year period between 1175 and 1200, mostly in large cities because that's where all the people are. Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and Oxford are four of the main ones. Now, unlike, again, modern universities, because we have just easy access to technology and, if not that, at least books, rather than each university having multiple departments, each university was its own department. You had to go to, if you wanted to, major wasn't even really a thing, but if you wanted to concentrate on certain things, you had to go to the university that did that. So, for example, the university in Bologna emphasized civil law because they discovered Justinian's corpus of civil law, which discussed how to build and maintain towns and trade as you had more and more people, because that was just something that they didn't have in the Middle Ages, and now that's becoming a thing, and people aren't sure how to manage it properly. Things are becoming chaotic, and then they find this old book from Justinian, literally from centuries before, and they basically built a university around that book. So if you want to learn about civil law, you went to Bologna. Boulogne also received special protection from Frederick Barbarossa. That's, again, the Holy Roman Emperor who ends up dying on crusade. But hey, this is before that. Um, because local towns were trying to charge exorbitant taxes, rents, and food prices to the students and masters. Because if you've ever been to, say, uh, Clemson, which are really any town that is mostly a college town, the prices are more expensive there because if you're a student there, you're stuck, more or less. And they can raise prices and charge you more because that's just the reality. Um, I mean, it's the same as if you've ever been inside, like, any kind of enclosed festival, like a music festival, or like at a civic center. Once you're inside, they can charge you whatever the hell they want. You $5 for a bottle of water, sucks for you. $5 for a bottle of water. Oh, you want a hot dog? $6, $7. It's the worst hot dog you've ever had in your life, but that's all you're getting. It was like that, but in an entire town. So, with Frederick Barbarossa, he created the university as the Universitas Societas Magisterium Disciplinique, whatever. University is an association or guild of masters and students, which is to say they had certain rights and protections that a guild would have, associations of craftsmen would have, and therefore were protected by law from such extortion, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So a university is, by definition, a guild, and therefore protected by the same laws that protect the guilds. So that's cool. So scholasticism, this was an intellectual movement that came out of the university thinkers between about 1150 and 1350. Basically, this brought together logic and reason, but specifically, let me find a way to word that more concisely. It's thought and reason, but not in the way that you'd see like in the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment, where we're people and we can therefore decide what truth is. This is still the Middle Ages. This is still very, everything is decided by God or whatever spiritual being we're looking at. But we can explain more things through logic and reason than we could before. We're gradually understanding more stuff because we're thinking beings. So Thomas Aquinas, this is another dude that it felt like I knew him personally during my time at Providence College, because he was a Dominican friar, and everybody at Providence College loved this guy. So I knew who Thomas Aquinas was before I even took a class about this era. So he was a university student who became a Dominican friar. He was originally going to be a lawyer, but then the way it's told, it almost has then he fell in with the wrong crowd and started like hanging out with some Dominican friars, and his brothers like kidnapped him and tried to deprogram him and make him go back to what he was doing. But as soon as he got away, he went back to being a Dominican friar. It's an interesting story. Anyway, his big thing is he synthesized scholasticism, this university thought, with Christian faith. So he brought in this logic and reason with what was Catholic doctrine. He wrote Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologica. Summa Theologica, again, if you guys actually have the book, there's a bit on it on 691, which is basically this thesis on like how God exists, etc. And while this definitely didn't get him too many friends in the higher ups of the Catholic Church, this soon became like the standard for Catholicism, because as the world became more interested in logic and reason, as we get into the Renaissance and then eventually the Enlightenment, it was really easy for the Catholic Church to go, wait, we had one of those. We can do that too. And so they went back to Thomas Aquinas. In fact, I mean, even to this day, people quote Thomas Aquinas. So this synthesis of university thought with Catholic faith really became like the standard. Which, as I've already said that, I'm just repeating myself now. So there's Thomas Aquinas. Oh, he was called the dumb ox by his contemporaries. It's not what it sounds like. Well, Connor, since you're in here, do you know what the original meaning for the word dumb was, right? You don't? Okay, that's fine. I was just curious. Dumb originally meant that you weren't able to speak. It didn't have anything to do with like intelligence. It because like a lot of times, especially in older literature, you'll read that someone is deaf and dumb, which simply means they can't hear and therefore can't speak. Because if you can't hear, you certainly typically aren't able to speak. That's important. So yeah, and he called him an ox because the student was huge. He was built big. He wasn't fat. He was a linebacker. He was built real big. And again, in the Middle Ages, like being over 5'4", you were big. So this guy was real large. And he typically didn't speak unless he had something to say. So he would just like sit and listen to conversations, and he wouldn't speak up unless he actually had something that he felt was necessary to input. So a lot of his detractors would say that, oh, well, he can't even talk. He doesn't ever speak. He just sort of sits there like an ox. But it wasn't that he was stupid or dumb, again, to use the original term where he couldn't talk. It's just that he would listen and speak when he felt like he should. That's where that name comes from, in case you were curious. All right, so there he is. And then one last thing is the kind of the penultimate cathedrals of the Gothic age. The Cathedral of Béveux reached 157 feet. However, during a windstorm in 1284, the choir collapsed. It really got to the point that they could not build any larger with the technology that they had. They were still using stone and wood, there was no steel beams, really not even structural iron. So they had reached the limit of size. So the Gothic architecture started to move towards a rayonnant style, which is, I guess, French. It seems French for radiant. where the overall size of the church was smaller, um, but they really focused on the stained glass windows, which I have so many pictures. um, so smaller size, more stained glass windows, which resulted in a sort of a warmer, more intimate feeling. So you walked in and you weren't immediately like struck by feeling like you were in some massive cavern. Now, granted, they were still freaking huge, compared to modern Protestant churches that are maybe 2 or 3 stories high at most, not counting the steeple. These things were still freaking huge, but compared to older Gothic churches, they were smaller. Um, and also, university thought started to fall away. By the 14th century, university thought started to spread apart, began reaching logical extremes, where instead of coming together with similar ideas, they really started to shift into very polarizing camps of thought. But unfortunately, they don't get very much time to worry about that too much. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So, quick run through of the million images I have. The rose windows were even more ornate than they were before. I mean, just good God, look at that one. There's a lot going on here. There's one from the inside that's not just like blacked out. So you not only have the rose window, but all this gold leaf around it. Here is not just the rose window, but the stained glass windows around that, and then the ceiling with the vaulted arches here. And again, everything's all gold leaf. This is one that, I think this one's in the book. Is this one in the book? This might be the one in the book. I think this is the one in the book, but the one in the book is lower down so you can see the floor. This one's a little bit higher up, but it's just like the walls look like they're just made of glass. You can barely see any structural supports between them other than the big main ones. There's a few little places here, to keep it just from collapsing in at the slightest breeze. But yeah, it's huge. It's all, again, stained glass, gold leaf, just magnificent color. And again, you're in there, the sun comes through these windows, and it's just, it's really magnificent. If you've never been in, but not necessarily a Catholic church, but any of these churches with stained glass windows, when the sun's coming in the window, it's quite nice. It's quite pretty. All right. Let's get on to chapter 10, get as much of that done, and we'll hopefully finish it on Monday, because that's all the time I've got left. All right. Late Middle Ages. This is where everything goes to shit. So, here we go. We had a little ice age. So, after the medieval warm period, when everybody was, growing food all over the place, and they were making wine in England and all sorts of stuff, the temperature started to drop over the next 100 years, resulting in ice and glaciers expanding across the northern hemisphere. Now, this largely affected the far north. North settlements were forced out of places like Greenland, which is why, for example, by the time Christopher Columbus stumbles his way into North America, there's no more Norse settlements in Vinland, as they called it, because of this time period. There were glaciers overrunning their settlements. Like, we gotta leave. As far as Europe, the temperatures were cool. The temperatures were cooler. The summers were rainier, and it destroyed a lot of crops. Normally you think, oh, well, more rain is good. Well, not when it's washing away your entire field. Um, so the agricultural areas were completely devastated. Northern France especially was hit hard, um, whereas areas that were doing things that weren't agriculture, like mining areas in Germany or places that just did regular trade, like Italy, were able to become more prominent on the world stage. Now, granted, still, if the agriculture is taking a hit, everybody's going to be hurting eventually. Because turns out everybody has to eat. So you can see the shift between the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. It was a pretty substantial drop. And for a completely agrarian society, it hurt. It hurt a lot. And it really didn't start recovering until almost 1900. And then, of course, we have kind of overcorrected for that, but that's a different class. Obviously, due to lots of factors, including the weather shift, the unsustainably high population, and 7 years of crop failures, due in part to the poor weather, there was horrific famine throughout Europe. And when I say bad famine, I mean 4 and 5 million people died just from starvation. That's not you don't normally see numbers like that. Like when it's famine, it's like, oh, well, the people are suffering and you're losing, a few thousand to disease because they're weak from not having food. No, this is whole areas just dying out entirely from not having food. Also, when I say 7 years in a row of crop failure, what that means, I think I might have mentioned to you guys before. So I was going to say back then, but even today, when you grow stuff on a farm and you harvest it, especially if it's grain, wheat is the easiest example. You harvest the wheat, you take a percentage that you're going to use for food, you take a percentage you're going to sell, if you've made enough to sell, the stuff you're going to sell is always going to be the extra. And then you're always going to save a certain percentage for the next year to use as seed to grow, because the wheat that you make the food out of, that you make bread out of, is also the seed to grow more wheat. So you're going to save a percentage of that for the next year to grow. Well, when the crops fail, that doesn't mean it all dies. That means you're losing a lot of it. So you still need to have enough to eat. And then you're going to only have a little bit left to put over for the next year. So the next year you're going to have less wheat. And then the crops fail again. So you're left with even less wheat. And you still need to have a little bit to eat and have a tiny bit left over for the next year, hoping that maybe that crop survives and you can start building back up again. And then that fails. So you're getting down to literally nothing after multiple years of crop failure. And by this point, we're not even trying to sell it anymore. We're just surviving. So yeah, when we talk about multiple crop failures in a row, that's what we're looking at, where they're not even having enough seed to grow crops the next year. Which is something that Russia does to Ukraine in World War II, but we'll get to that next semester too. Grain prices rose 800% because, again, there was no grain to go around, so the prices jumped up, causing grain riots in towns and cities because, well, people weren't able to afford what grain there was, and people were rioting because, well, when you're starving, you're willing to do all sorts of stuff. And also when your children are starving, you're willing to do all sorts of stuff. Also, the people that survived were severely weakened because, I mean, you have gone years now without adequate food. I mean, you've clearly had enough to get by, um, but especially if you were growing up during this period, your immune system has been permanently damaged. And also, by the way, the plague is coming. The Black Death is about to be here. They obviously didn't know that. They weren't like, oh, we better prepare for this thing that's about to wipe out half of the continent. Um, they were just trying to survive the famine. They didn't realize that that was just like a precursor to how bad things were about to get. Also, we had this weird thing happening with the church. So King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII had a bit of a disagreement. It resulted in a division among the Pope's Curia, which is the papal court, I guess, whether they should support the French king or the Pope's policies, which feels pretty cut and dry. You know, should you, the people who work for the Pope, support the Pope or the French king? But apparently there was a split. And the next guy who became Pope, which would have been part of the Curia, so, you know, one of the guys that was questioning whether we should support the old Pope or the king, decided that, hey, we should just work with the King of France and move the papacy to Avignon in southern France, which meant the Roman Catholic Church was no longer based in Rome. It was based in southern France. Now, granted, Avignon's lovely. You couldn't pick a better place to spend some time other than like a literal tropical island. But like, we're talking about Mediterranean. Avignon's a pretty good place to be. Also, we had the Knights Templar happening around this time. I mean, granted, the Knights Templar have been around since the First Crusade. They were originally known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, Templars for short. They were there to protect the pilgrims going to the Holy Land for pilgrimage, obviously, and also dispense charity. But because they ended up with a lot of money, because people supported them, and to support a branch of the church, you just give them land and money. They would give loans to people, including kings. So Philip, the King of France, owed the Templars a lot of money. And he decided, rather than getting money together and paying the Templars back, he would have the Pope, who was technically in charge of the Knights, dissolve them with trumped up crimes, including, I like to read these out. Let's see. Where's the... Here we go. King Philip was heavily in its debt, yada yada yada. Accused the order of holding secret and criminal ceremonies, perpetuating obscene and illegitimate acts, such as spitting on the cross. Okay. It was whispered that the Knights practiced idolatry, held heretical beliefs, participated in sexual crimes, and were corrupt in their handling of donations. With the Pope's support, Philip ordered the arrest of the Templar leaders, had them tortured, forced them to confess to false charges, and burned them at the stake. Now the king doesn't owe the Templars any money because the Templars are gone. So apparently you get in good with the Pope, and if you owe any of the Pope's underlings any money, you can just have them killed, and now you don't owe them any money because they're not around. Here's the Papal Palace in Avignon. Again, quite a lovely Mediterranean town. Very Assassin's Creed 2. Speaking of. Here is one of the remaining Templar castles. Obviously, not held by Templars anymore, but it's a historical structure that has been kept from being torn down. So, hey, we've still got one of these to look at least. This guy's enjoying burning these people at the stake way too much. He is so chill. He looks high. He looks like he's had a little bit, and he's just vibing. Though I should mention, the Templars technically still exist. I'm not talking about the weird Ubisoft, Illuminati, Assassin's Creed shit. They are just a bunch of weird old men with weird outfits, but that's basically all it is. They're like the Masons. They're just a society of old men that don't do anything. Spoiler alert: the Masons don't do anything. Like, I knew a guy who was in the Masons, and they don't do anything. They're not the boogeyman that people think they are. They have funny hats. They have little medals that don't mean anything, and they go to little meetings to pretend like they are important, and that's it. They don't do anything. So, the Holy Roman Empire was also like completely falling apart. Holy Roman Emperor was elected, however, was not able to create a dynastic line because the rival German princes would put a weak competitor on the throne to make sure that the position of Holy Roman Emperor was weak, so there wouldn't be some powerful emperor in charge of the Germanic lands. Also, because the Holy Roman Emperor was technically beholden to the safety of the Pope, he often was pulled into issues in Italy, which technically was not his business, but because Holy Roman Emperor was tied in with the Pope, he still had to deal with it. So being the Holy Roman Emperor sucked. You didn't have any power, but you had to do a bunch of stuff that just drained your resources. We do have Charles IV of Bohemia. He issued the Golden Bull, which a bull is just an edict that is sent out by the Pope. Well, actually, a bull is an edict sent out by any sufficiently high leader during this period. So, the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor is called the Golden Bull because it had a golden seal. That's all that is. It's not a bull like the animal. It's just that. Anyway, this kind of straightened out all this mess with the Holy Roman Empire. It made it so that the electoral process wouldn't be used to keep the empire weak. And he kind of did a Charlemagne. He had a lively court culture, had luminaries and visionary thinkers. So he was really the last high point of the Holy Roman Empire. He was doing his best to make the Holy Roman Empire something again. Before, well, everything fell apart. Because obviously, they can't see the future. They don't know what's coming. So he's just hoping to rebuild the power of the Holy Roman Empire. Maybe be another Charlemagne. Unfortunately, England and France were busy with other stuff. The 100 Years' War, for example. Technically, this lasted over the course of 116 years and was multiple sporadic wars. It wasn't just a constant conflict of 100 years. But it it lasted about 100 years, so that's just what we're going to call it. So, technically, this was over territorial claims in England. Um, sorry, territorial claims by England on the continent, because, as I had said with Richard Lionheart, technically, Normandy, sorry, reverse that. Technically, England was part of Normandy, not the other way around. England was the extra. England was the offshoot. England was the, the additional land. But by this point, the kings had kind of shifted their focus to England, and now Normandy, which was, again, still on the continent, still basically in France, was kind of the extra holding back on the continent. So this led to some skirmishes between the English and French over some land that were important to English commercial interests, but technically the French still held, and the English made claims about how, well, technically we still hold Normandy, so therefore we still have claims over these bits of land, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, it's any old medieval war. They just wanted land. However, there was also the issue of secession, because obviously there was. So the King of France, King Charles IV, died without leaving an heir. Because of why would you do that? There should be a rule where as soon as you become king, you have to make an heir. Even if you don't have any kids, like, okay, if I die right now, this is who's going to be heir. And then if I have kids, then they take over. But whatever, like, none of this dying without heir crap, because that keeps happening. So King Edward III of England claimed the French throne for himself because, again, technically, he was the ruler of Normandy, which was a vassal of France, which meant that he was a French noble and therefore in line to the French crown. Obviously, the French told him he could stuff it, and the French instead crowned Philip VI of Valois as king. So in 1337, Edward launched an invasion of France. Now, this is the 100 Years' War, and there's a lot to it. We're not going to get too much into the weeds about the 100 Years' War, but there's a few bits that I do want to talk about for various reasons. One, because when it comes to this period of history, I just like talking about England. They've always got something going on. And, I mean, the 100 Years' War is like one of their biggest things during this period. So, France had a population about 3 times that of England. So they definitely had the numbers advantage. And, I mean, England was invading France, so, again, for sure, they had the numbers advantage. However, the English had a substantial advantage when it came to tactics and technology. They would either pay off towns to surrender to them, or if the towns wouldn't, they would starve them out. By 1346, Edward was outside the walls of Paris. So really quickly, things were not going good for France. Which I know is like a joke, but, France used to be a major power. Anyway, the first big battle was Crécy. The French were surrounded on 3 sides, largely by longbows, which is not something you want. The French, however, believed in themselves simply superior to the English, charged into the English anyway, and were torn to shreds. There is one particular um, story of a French noble who was basically, he was so old that he was half blind. He couldn't sit up in his saddle properly, so they had to tie him to his saddle. And in order for him to charge in the correct direction, he had to have two of his vassals tie their horses to the side of his horse, which I'm sure the horses loved, um, so they would charge in the correct direction. In the Battle of Crécy, he supposedly said, charge closer so that I might hit them with my sword. And they later found the bodies of him, his vassals, and their horses all together filled with arrows. Never quite made it close enough to hit them with his sword. And so it's apparently still like a thing in England if there's anything about like closing a distance with somebody. It's like, drive me closer so that I might hit them with my sword. It's just an English joke now. It's been 700 years, but that's just a thing. That's the English, yeah. Now the French had crossbows, which are powerful, but they don't have quite the range that the longbows do, and longbows can fire faster. For a crossbow, especially back then, you had to basically put it on the ground, put the bolt in, and then crank it back. You didn't pull it back with your hand. You had to like crank it back with essentially a wheel, and then you fired the bolt. With a bow, you knocked the arrow, you pulled it back, you lifted it up, you let it go. You let it essentially fly like an artillery piece, and then you pulled out the next arrow. Much faster, much higher range. The French were torn to pieces. Now, obviously the Battle of Crécy didn't end the war, because this is the 100 Years' War. This wasn't the Battle of Crécy. 1356 was a two-pronged English assault. One prong was led by Edward, Prince of Wales, who was also known as the Black Prince. We're not sure exactly why he was called this, if it was because his armor was black, or if his heraldry was black, like the flag that he carried, or what. But he was called the Black Prince for some reason. There you go. We don't know entirely why. He led an outnumbered force at the Battle of Poitiers, so he was outnumbered by the French pretty substantially. However, not only did he and his men defeat the French, but he captured King John II, who was the new and current French king. Pretty significant victory there. This resulted in the Treaty of Bretigny, whatever. This ransomed John back to the French, gave England a lot of land, Aquitaine and the trading city of Calais, which is actually one of the last cities that England gives up to France at the end of the war. So this is, again, very early in the war, setting up early stuff, and then the war was going to drag on. But yeah, this is, I like this image because this is, normal distance between your archers and your crossbowmen. You've got your infantry and your cavalry in the back, archers in the front. That's normal. That's how I play Mount and Blade. Chivalry. So chivalry is from the French word cheval, which just means horse, and a chevalier is a horseman or a knight. So there you go. So this defined the kind of conduct that you were supposed to show as a knight. Now, granted, this evolved. Knights were not these chivalrous do-gooders that we think of today, early in the Middle Ages, they were thugs. They were glorified robbers. They would just go around, they burn down towns, they take whatever they wanted. They would murder, women and children for fun. But they were nobility, so they could get away with it. However, as the Crusades came along, they became more heroic, at least in the eyes of the Europeans, certainly not the people they were murdering in, the Middle East. But hey, at least they were doing the murdering over there, right? So they were these, these glorious crusaders. And then as the Crusades died out and they came back, and knights started becoming less and less important because now we're getting peasant armies and, infantry, and we're getting back to the formation warfare like we had in Greece and Rome, where dudes on horseback aren't the only army anymore. We start to make up what they are. There are these noble gentlemen, spiritual strivers, these, heroes that are greater than, 100 men on foot, which was definitely not true. It's the same thing that happened with the samurai in Japan. The samurai were never seen as these noble heroes with a code of honor until the samurai were almost done being important. And they're like, oh, we need to make ourselves like a thing in society before we're completely just pushed aside. Because before that, same thing. They were thugs, they were robbers, they could do whatever they wanted because they were nobility. Nobody could stop them. But then as we get to like the Meiji Restoration and they were no longer needed, suddenly it was like, we've always been important, guys. We've always been like noble warriors that protected the downtrodden. Just forget about all the atrocities. Because by the 1320s, we had gunpowder and cannons. And even before gunpowder and cannons, we had longbows and crossbows. And your knights can have all the armor they want. You get hit in the chest by a bow or by an arrow, you're dead. Your armor isn't going to stop an arrow going, 120 miles an hour. It's going to go through your armor and through you. They were no longer these immortal warriors because before, when knights fought other knights, they rarely killed each other. And this wasn't because of some noble idea of honorable combat, but it's because A, their armor was too thick for them to get their swords through, and B, it was so damn heavy that it was basically a stamina contest. You just beat the crap out of each other until one of you got tired and gave up. That's how actual knight combat was. There was no sword against sword, trying to find an opening. It was just you beat the crap out of each other with whatever weapon you had until one guy got tired and gave up. That's what that was. It was an MMA fight with armor. That's why, like, if you see actual medieval combat, like, they use the pommel of the sword as much as they use the blade, because you're just blunt smashing them in the head just to try to make them dizzy. Yeah. So stuff like this didn't exist. Maybe ceremonial back home armor for like riding through the streets and showing how glamorous you are. This was not battle anything. It's just also, I found this and I thought it was very funny, so I included it. Anyway, I think we'll have enough time to do at least this first part of this, because I don't want to end with time on the clock, because like I said, I want to be able to finish this. So, let's start. Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, bubonic plague. So, Um, Europeans were weakened by the Great Famine, and also they hadn't dealt with this in about 600 years, not since the plague of Justinian. So when the Black Death hit, they were not prepared at all. There was no, this was like smallpox going through the Native Americans. They were not prepared for it. Even though actually the smallpox hitting Native Americans was like a 90% death rate, it was actually significantly worse. But anyway, I'm not comparing pandemics right now. Speaking of, it was a pandemic. It spread over many regions much more quickly, communicable between the infected, and had a very high mortality. So, yeah, it was real bad. Obviously, with the cities growing at this time, we had larger concentrations of people, which meant that the disease was able to spread more quickly. Because if you just have a bunch of farms out in the countryside that are spread by miles apart, it's not going to spread very quickly, if at all, because the people aren't really, you're not visiting your neighbor's house 2 miles down, especially when your fastest mode of transport is donkey. But the cities, you're getting ships in, which I think that's probably the next. Yeah. Originally started in Asia, killed about 30 million people in China before it made its way over. Infected fleas on rats, which we're now kind of figuring out maybe wasn't rats, it was maybe gerbils, because of the weather in China at the time, based on evidence that we've been able to gather. Gerbils were just as wild in China as rats were, and the weather there was either wet or it was either unseasonably wet or unseasonably dry. Whichever one that gerbils preferred was what it was in China, which meant there was more of them than rats, and they are just as likely to get on ships as rats were, and therefore they were likely the ones that made it over via ship and began spreading the disease. So it's gerbils' fault. Anyway, they made it to Italy in 1347. It became quickly clear that something was wrong because the ships got there and most of the crew was dead and had big sores and stuff. So they quarantined the ships, which actually quarantine comes from the Italian word 40 days, because that was what a quarantine was you're stuck for 40 days until whatever's happening dies out. Whether you die or not isn't our problem. However, because rodents are really good at walking along ropes from ship to shore, they made it into the city anyway, and then to the continent. And some days the plague was able to move 5 to 10 miles a day, which, again, at a time when travel was really, really, really primitive, is pretty substantial. Like, we weren't back to Roman roads. We don't get back to, our roads today still kind of suck compared to Roman roads. Yeah, so still. It also hit the Islamic lands and Constantinople, killed huge swaths of the population. So again, we talk about how much it killed in Europe, but basically anywhere it hit, it killed between a third and half of the population. It was absurdly devastating. There were three main types of Yersinia pestis. Bubonic plague, which is what we're most familiar with because it's the most common. It was transmitted by the infected fleas biting you. This resulted in the buboes, hence bubonic, which were the lymph nodes swelling up in the armpits, groins, and necks. It lasted about a week, and you had about a 50-60% chance of dying. So this is coin flip whether you live or die. And you had about a week to worry about it. Then there was the pneumonic plague. This was transmitted like the common cold. It was human to human via air and surfaces. So if you like coughed on your hand and then, well, I guess doorknobs weren't really a thing back then, but you know, you put your hand on something and then someone put their hand on that and then rubbed their face, then they could get it. This was awful because not only could it spread much more easily and much more quickly, it only incubated for 3 days, and you only had about a 5% chance of surviving. 95 to 100% chance mortality rate. And then there's one more. The septicemic plague. This was where the bacteria directly infected your bloodstream. Now, I know that seems like it would be hard to happen, but I mean, considering they were dealing with dead bodies all the time and people with open wounds was not uncommon, so getting someone else's blood in your blood could happen. And if their blood was infected and their blood got in your blood, congratulations, you're dead. You're just dead. That's it. Period. Nothing, no, your body's not fighting back. That's it. Also, for those of you that don't know, it's still around, by the way. Here's some images of the buboes. They're awful little welts, pustules, etc. Now, I should mention that this is a bacteria, which means antibiotics kills it. Obviously, back then, they didn't have antibiotics. Today, we have antibiotics. So if you get the Black Death, you're gonna feel like shit, but unless you're like out in the woods away from civilization and you can't get to a doctor's, you should be fine. If you are out in the woods and you get the Black Death, well, sorry. I guess you're dying out in the woods. A couple more things. By 1348, all major port cities were dealing with this, and as I said, it soon jumped to the mainland. Many cities lost half their populations over about 6 months, which, I mean, again, that's hard to even fathom. Like, half the city is gone in less than half a year. Over the course of the winter, the plague did slow down, and seemingly, for some of the people, like, oh, it's gone away, wonderful. But in the winter, the fleas are going to slow down because they're cold-blooded, and the rats or gerbils, whatever little rodent assholes were doing this, they're going to find a warm place to hide too. But then once spring hit, they were back and began spreading again. Over the course of 4 years, 35 to 40% of Europe's population, another 30 million people, were dead. This very nearly destroyed European society, which we'll talk more about on Monday. But this also created the modern personification of death. The idea of the Grim Reaper, this like skeletal figure in a hooded robe with like a scythe. That's where this came from, because everyone was daily confronted with death. Everyone was, you walked outside and you saw corpses every day. Someone new was dead every day. You were probably going to be dead the next day. Who knew? If you were probably infected. You had a 50-50 chance. You might live, you might die. Who knows? Death was everywhere. And so here's Constantinople again. But this idea of like the living skeletons and death as like a physical being was created during this period, because they needed some way to process all this. And the idea of death literally walking into town and taking these people away made more sense than people are just dying for no reason. Because obviously they don't know that it's the fleas and the rats and stuff. Okay, one more thing and then we'll be done. Yeah. Bodies were left unburied because there weren't enough people to dig graves. Again, we're losing half the population. And the half that are still alive are probably weakened from surviving it. Doctors and grave diggers died in much higher percentages because they were the ones who were dealing with the dead or dying. By the way, when a person covered in infected fleas dies and their body gets cold, the fleas want to find somewhere warm. And if you're burying a body, they're coming to you. So that was a problem. Also, just morality in general broke down. Live for today because tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. Familial bonds broke down. Husbands and wives abandoned each other. They abandoned their children to try to save themselves. Churches tried to provide aid and comfort, but again, we're losing half the damn population. And the other half is horrifically sick. And also the church is losing a lot of people because they're trying to help people and they're getting infected as well. So it was like end of the world shit for these people. And I always like using this for the plague doctor. But anyway, yeah, so, and actually the plague doctor outfit did kind of help. They'd poke at the victims with their stick, and the robes would actually keep most of the fleas off, and then their mask here, which was actually meant to keep the bad smells of the rotting bodies out off of them. They put, like petunias and whatnot in there. They thought it was miasma, right? Bad air, essentially, was what was causing this. But because this whole thing was like sealed up as much as you could back then, it did somewhat help keep the fleas out. So it did help a little bit. Okay, good, because the next is responses to the plague, and we'll do that on Monday. And I should hopefully be able to knock this thing out, and then we'll do the review after Thanksgiving. Whew. We're almost done. Now I just got to put this up on Blackboard.